is my absolute pleasure to introduce Ronnie Kasrils, who is a South African politician. He was the Minister for the Intelligence Services from April 27, 2014 to September 25th, 2004 to 2008, and was a member of the National Executive Committee and the African National Congress from 1987 to 2007, as well as a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party from December 1986 to 2007. Alongside many South Africans involved in the struggle against apartheid, the Sharpeville massacre radicalized him against the apartheid system, and he joined the African National Congress in 1960, becoming Secretary of the Congress of Democrats in Natal in 1961. The same year, he joined the South African Communist Party. In 1962, he received a 5-year banning order prohibiting him from public speaking. He was a founding member of Umkhonto weSizwe and as a member of the Natal Regional Command during that same year. He became the commander of the Natal Regional, he underwent military training in 1964 in Odessa. USSR, at the end of 1965, was sent to London to work for the movement there. During this time, Kasrils worked with Yusuf Dadoo, Joe Slovo, and Jack Hodgson, and they formed a special committee from 1966 to 1977 to develop underground activities in South Africa from the United Kingdom. More recently, Kasrils is also a noted critic of what he calls the descent into police state depravity. In April 2014, he launched the No Vote campaign alongside fellow ANC member and former government minister Nozizwe Mhlahla. The campaign aims to encourage people to cast protest votes or spoiled ballots in the 2014 general elections as a protest against Zuma and the perceived corruption of his government. Can we please give this man a warm welcome?
Thanks very much. You ought to be very careful about applauding a subversive so loudly, otherwise you'll be charged with the same brush. But Sanibonani Dumelang, good to be here. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. Well, the subject today is what one might call the N word. Okay. Because nationalization has become like an N word. It's regarded as being atrocious and not to be spoken about in polite company. Since from the way you greeted me, I don't think you're such polite company, we'll be able to actually dispense with the N word and say nationalization. But you know, sometime, I think it was last year, I had a debate with a very prominent academic and actually a person who had been a great social activist here, Adam Habib, who had written, his book had come out, which you should read, South Africa, The Suspended Revolution. You know it. And how many times does the N word appear in Adam's book? You know, it's a long book, 400 pages or so, about South Africa, the unfinished revolution. And I said to him when I spoke, and I was quite kind about the book, it's a positive, interesting contribution. But I said, Adam, what's so remiss is that in that whole book, you mention nationalization once. And that's only in passing. It's not to dissect or analyze the issue at all. And I think it's expressive and reflects something that we ignore to our disadvantage. Whether we South Africans, whether we come from elsewhere in the continent, which just I might be wrong, I think it's a wonderful thing if we have some of you here from the rest of the continent. And in fact, not only people of Africa, but of the whole world, because nationalization has been given this very bad name, not by the likes of you and me and ordinary people and workers and rural people and so on. The people who've attacked it and have virtually made it taboo. And I'm not saying that there's everything right about nationalisation, but its most bitter opponents. And the most bitter opponents of nationalisation happen to be the capitalist class, happen to be those who believe that the only answer to the problems that humankind has on this lovely planet comes from those who want to attack private property. And private property is portrayed by them as the greatest good. So the fact that those who believe that the opposite of private ownership of all wealth, not your car, not your children, not your home. We're talking here about the commanding heights of the economy, the things that really produce the wealth. And that's the mines and the factories and the land and the farms and so on. And they portray that, as I've said, as the greatest good. The only way in which we can resolve the problems that we face, and what problems we face, whether we in Africa, Asia, Middle East, South America, whether we in China or in the United States or Britain or France. In fact, countries like Britain and France and Sweden and the Netherlands were countries 100 years ago that were really talking about the need to nationalise wealth and the railways and the waterways and the canals and factories and so on, and in fact did quite successfully for some time. So that needs to be brought in mind, because it's not the devil's language, the N-word. It's not something that simply came out of Stalin's Russia or Mao's China, where in fact it did tremendous things in terms of the immediate urgent needs to overcome the most dreadful poverty that's existed, was in countries like Russia and China, India and places like that. China took a socialist path, and of course India didn't. So there is this need for us in South Africa today to consider this, and the way the topic is being designed is, how did we get here? Nationalisation question, how did we get here? Looking to the future, and is there need for policy intervention? Those three questions. And I'll try and address these in the time that we've got. So it's just after 11:05, and our chairperson is just going to remind me. At the time, I think I've got 40-ish minutes, or 45, and then we have 20 for questions. So you're not going to be afraid of me, even though you read some terrible things about me and things that I've done. I'm just an old man now, and although I wrote a book called Armed and Dangerous about the armed struggle, a lot of my friends just say I'm armless and harmless now. So, in relation to these questions, I do want to first ask ourselves, what is nationalisation? Because it is regarded, I'm not talking now about those privateers and the capitalists who just damn it, but it has had some different outlooks, whether from Mao's China or Stalin's Russia or Fidel's Cuba, for instance, or from countries where nationalisation was carried out. I know Britain quite well because in exile I lived there for some time. And I can tell you something, it's such a toss-up of a coin whether the privatization of British railways has improved the services or not. So you see, I want to come with a nice soft option here so that we get away from just thinking of nationalisation as being from the Red Berets, although I want to come back to Comrade Malema and company, or from Cuba and China and so on, because as I mentioned already, these Western countries have indulged successfully in nationalisation when they had labour movements in power, or sometimes called social democratic, not communist. And I lived in Britain at a time when the railways really worked well, and it was nationalised. There was just one railway system, British Railways. And then under Thatcher, who with Reagan, Ronald like me, from the United States, the president and the prime minister of these countries, in the 80s, they were the ones who really brought about this big change, even in these Western countries, which impacted on Africa and Asia and so on. And it was called Reaganomics. It was about real free market privatization, 100%, selling off, as Britain, they termed it the family jewels, the great assets of the country, coal and steel, money, etc. And everything was privatized, including the railways. And it's interesting when I go to Britain now, my son's a trade unionist there, he was born there, he works for the Railway Transport and Maritime Union, and they in bitter struggles with the various companies, 5 or 6 that run the various railway tracks. And the public very often are saying that there is such a regression under the privatization. Fares go up to incredible degrees, service goes down. So I'm bringing this to your attention so that we don't automatically follow what's regarded as conventional wisdom. I'm sure you've heard that term, which doesn't come from ordinary people, let alone workers and the farming, peasant people, etc. It usually comes from those who run the companies, the conglomerates, the newspapers, and certain governments. Conventional wisdom, which just says, damn nationalisation, don't even think of the various aspects, so on, and just allow society to run in terms of the free market economy, sometimes now called neoliberalism, because that term can be quite heavy and confusing. It refers to a time in history when the idea of the liberal economy wasn't the nice, cozy liberalism you might have encountered at school, which is about tolerating people and so on, but it was about economic liberalism, being don't let the state interfere, nothing must be regulated, let business, let the companies do as they wish. That's what causes wealth. I want to rush ahead, in fact, to say to you, and perhaps we'll come back to this, that where has this neoliberalism, which dominates the world, and of course the biggest power in the world, America, is the key to it, with the West European, British and others following suit, the big capitalist powers, that it's brought, I would say, this untold suffering that we have in the world today, certainly the most extraordinary poverty and gulf in wealth and poverty imaginable. And Karl Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels in the 19th century, analysing capitalism, said that the nature of capitalism, of this private ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange, and sort of key aspects of the economy, not your own house and your own little plot where you're doing a bit of farming in your own house, but these big factories and the mines and the shipping and the railways, etc., that this is going to see control by fewer and fewer people, and wealth into fewer and fewer hands, whilst the rest of the world becomes poorer and poorer. And I'm sure you've heard of the terminology used, the Gini coefficient, as it's called, also a very strange word. The question of the 1% of the world that controls most of the economy of the world. And in fact, the 1% is a misnomer, because the 1% of the 7 billion is actually quite a considerable number of million. But in fact, when the researchers and the analysts peer into this, they are able to demonstrate that it's actually 60 families control over half the wealth of the world. Can you imagine? And in South Africa, the figure here, a broader figure, not quite as bad if we look at it this way, but dreadful, is that 20% of the countries are owning 75% of the wealth. 20% are owning 75% of the wealth. But recently, Oxfam came out with research which shows that 2 human beings in this country actually own 50% of the wealth. So whatever we start thinking then in our minds about what are we tolerating and whether we just believe what is presented to us, that the only way that the economy can move forward and give something of benefit to people is if the economy is in private hands. So let me go back to that point about the question of nationalization. What, in a very short sense, does nationalization mean to each and every one of us here? I'm not talking about the scare factor. I'm talking about when you hear the word nationalization, how would you define it? So I'm going to have a drink of my water while you think, and we'll see the boldest amongst you putting your hands up first, to offer us what is nationalization. Okay, over there.
There's transfer of business to state ownership.
Just repeat, I didn't.
The transfer of a income producing business to state ownership.
Pretty good. So transferring state business, private business to the state. That's on the road to it. Anyone at the back? Thanks, young man.
Maybe narrow the
Sorry, can you just talk up?
Maybe just narrow the definition a bit more to say a shift from privatization of key industries to being state-owned.
Right, okay. Do you all agree with this approach? It's correct. So it's the acquisition by the state of private property. Not your house and not your car. It's the acquisition of the heights of the economy. I'm just going to take my jacket off. The heights of the economy. So we're talking here about those aspects of the economy which are fundamental to economic life, whether it grows, whether it declines, how it's shaped, how people share in the wealth of the country. So the acquisition then, the heights of the economy, as I've already had mentioned, where we're talking here about the land, we're talking here about the minerals, we're talking here about the major factories, not your uncle's Smoleniana factory round the corner, or your mama's doing a little bit of making baby clothes, etc., or making some toys, or maybe making some parts that go towards a device or an engine for another company. We're talking here about the big steel industries, the big extractors of the minerals. We're talking here about shipbuilders. We're talking here about those who make the railways, those who have the iron ore factories, other monopoly factories that are very big, that producing cars on a big scale. But in a sense, it's the mineral wealth, the mines, the large factories that become monopolized, that are so big, like Anglo-American in this country, that are so big that actually it's not only that they're employing, let's say, 500,000 people, but that the lives of everybody is affected. And when it comes to the land, it's not your gogo, your grandfather, an uncle, be they black or white, who has some small little orchard or some small little sugarcane field, like a great leader of the ANC, Albert Lutuli, once had at Groutville in the then Natal. But Hewlett's, big firms that not only exist in our own country but are around the world. And more, as Martin Engels said, these monopolies will become conglomerates astriding the world and affecting not only your country but whole continents and in fact the world. So that when we say that 60 people, 60 families now own over half the world's wealth, you must understand that those who have such wealth, Rothschilds, Oppenheimers, Rockefellers, and so on, DuPonts, these people are the unseen hand behind government.
The invisible hand.
Not just little Guptas. Not just. Because in fact, even in South Africa, a family called Gupta are quite small compared to Oppenheimers, compared to Anton Rupert, compared to Ackerman, who are doing some very nice business with government. Only they've been capitalists for a very long time. So now they know how to keep out of sight and they don't have to do things in a bit of a crude way, like fly in the family for a wedding, okay, and get the president to allow this to happen at an Air Force base. You see, when you become more acquainted with your wealth and power, Rothschilds, Oppenheimers, and so on, they never make such stupid mistakes. They would never go and say, we want to bring the family in to this Waterkloof Air Base. In fact, maybe it's not that they're clever, because actually they have their own aeroplanes and they have their own landing strips. So you see, if Oppenheimer was having a wedding in Sun City, where the wedding of the Guptas took place, you can be sure whether it's Oppenheimer or Anton Rupert that they'll have a nice little airstrip there and they don't have to bother government. The Guptas only came in recently, so they don't have that. But it's so important that we understand how capital works, how the concentration of wealth works, and how it works on governments. And I would say that our once proud government, which, like not only here, Angola and Mozambique and Zimbabwe and many other countries where people sacrifice lives, come to power, and want to be the servants of the people, how there can be corruption, bribery and corruption, if you don't stick to your principles, you put yourself first, and you so easily slip into the hands of those whose purpose is to control you and control governments. You know, there's so many books that have been written now from all over the world about the secret forces behind government and the wars that they run. So you'll know that the war against Saddam Hussein, against Iraq, which is responsible, the smashing of Iraq, responsible for the terrible problems and deaths and destruction that has taken over this once very proud and strong land, which might have had a dictator. I'm not now saying Saddam Hussein was an angel at all. But you'll see people say, when Saddam was here, at least we had safety and security. And we could carry out our little business or whatever. Whether it's Libya, wherever the situation is, you see. And with Iraq, what was so obvious, because those Americans are actually a bit like the Pural Guptas. They're very easy to identify, Bush and company, with people like the Billiton, not Billiton, sorry, that's South African, the Secretary of Defense of America and so on, who immediately in Iraq created, they had control of the oil and the industries there, and it passed into their hands. Donald Rumsfeld was the defense minister. And this is how governments actually carry out the function of business and of capital. So we really must understand that when you now use the N word and you threaten private property, then you are in the crosshairs of these people. Which is why poor old Gaddafi, a man I knew, I wouldn't say I admired him that much, but he was standing for his people. He had some weird ideas. But when he decided, after kissing the Queen's hand and being her guest in Buckingham Palace, not long before they decided to invade him and finally kill him, the reason why they did that was Gaddafi started handing out contracts to the Russians and the Chinese and not keeping it to the British and the Americans and the Italians and so on. So talking of nationalization then is extremely important, because coming back now to that aspect, let me say this to you. As a socialist, as someone who has imbibed Marxism, I've been in a communist party. I left our communist party in ANC for reasons that I felt they were no longer serving the people of the country. Don't want to go into that too much now. It'll divert us. But in fact, in relation to the question here, what you will find if you read Marx and Engels is not, yes, they don't believe in a deity, but there's aspects there that you will find, whether it's in the Quran, whether it's in the Bible, and the questions of how Christ, the prophet, if you're a Muslim, Christ, Son of God, if you're a Christian, or a lax Jew, if you're a Jew, because that's what he had been, was a person who believed in equality of people and egalitarianism and stood with the poor against the moneylenders of the temple, etc. If you are Muslim, you will see how the Prophet and how Islam talks about not the way it's been absolutely abused by elements today, but its true meaning about the universality of people and so on. And in the sense of socialism, it's about equality and egalitarianism. It's not about which the people who attack it try to make out, that it'll reduce all of us here into people who have no individuality, who will just share the woman amongst the men and so on. And we won't be allowed to own anything, not even our own clothes and rubbish like that. The point about the question of ownership, to be reminded, is that all our ancestors, going very far, far, far back into pre-written history, lived communal lives. That's where the word communism comes from. It means communal in an egalitarian sense, where there was no private ownership. And they shared everything. It's called primitive communism, a very low level of technology. But once there was the production of value, classes began to emerge to dominate and control private ownership and make slaves of everybody else. And in each society, we see how there's the change from that egalitarian communism into slave society, into feudal society where the nobles are the rulers, and then into bourgeois capitalist society. So with socialism, the question that they raise is, in order to create a society where people have greater opportunities, not just achieving the vote and political rights, but decent economic life, that you need to socialize, you need to nationalize in the first extent the hearts of the economy, so that the major elements of society work for the betterment of the people. And the socialists look, or the communists look, towards a stage where we don't have classes. So they see the role of the state, and as was pointed out, the acquisition of the hearts of the economy as withering away, so that we then get the ownership as social ownership, not state ownership or control, but social ownership. You can read about that if you're interested in Marxism, but in terms of the approach, nationalism then can be a nationalism which is political and ideological, where those who are socialists come to power and they move to acquire the heights of the economy, the land, the mineral wealth, etc., for the benefit of the people, and make sure it works for the benefit of the people. And that can be done by coercion, and it can be done without compensation. And that happens in revolutions, like in China and Russia and Cuba. Or it can happen through negotiation. But the other form of nationalization is not nationalization with political ideological approach to changing society, but it's more pragmatic. And it's like the British model, the Swedish model, the French model that they had and which worked. And that is where they decide that there's certain elements of the economy, like, say, electrification, like sewage, like water, like providing lighting in the city, like creating roads, like a railway network, that these are very important strategically, that they can't leave this to private enterprise, and that the state, using the taxes of the people, will utilize this and be in charge. So in South Africa, under the Nationalist Party, you had ISCOR in charge of iron production in this country. And you had the South African Railways, which worked damn well. So you can have that, whether you're a racist government, whether you're a fascist government, whether you are social democratic, where it's worked better than in those other examples. I'll give you an example in today's world, and then I want to come into South Africa and why we've got into this predicament and what's the way forward. But when we consider this various forms of nationalization, you can be, let's say, the extreme socialist left-wing approach, or you can be a middle approach, social democratic, sometimes called mixed economy, where some elements of the state have nationalized the wealth, the production, and other is left to the private sector. And that's been the case in quite a number of countries. Britain at one stage, certainly Sweden is a very good example of Scandinavian countries, and France to some degree. You see, countries that have had quite strong left-inclined governments. So in terms of a mixed economy, there's a country called Norway. It's got about 10 or 12 million people. So if you can think of Norway on your world map, you've got what's called the North Sea, and that's between Norway and Scotland, part of Britain. I was in England in the 1960s when, in that North Sea, they discovered incredible reserves of oil and gas. It's so incredible that today it still produces the millions of barrels of gas and oil a year. And they had a big debate. And in Britain, where privatization was such a creed and so strong, they left the exploitation of the North Sea and the derivatives from that to the private sector entirely. Across the North Sea in Norway, they decided that this was so valuable, this resource was so strategic, it could be of such benefit to society as a whole, that they provided a type of a nationalization. They didn't keep out private companies, but they declared that they, the state, would own and control the reserves, and that they would allow, under their control, various companies of Norway to develop and do the work. It's a type of example that can be considered. It's worked incredibly well. So the revenue from North Sea oil and gas in Norway goes into profit for the companies that are doing work, but they are heavily taxed. They pay a huge royalty which goes into a state investment arm. And the results of such investment of what's called the Norwegian Sovereign Oil Fund is into the Treasury of Norway, ring-fenced to be used for health, education, pensions, the aged, and communication infrastructure. So after 50, 60 years, this wealth has accrued into the pockets, in certain respects, of people who were needing it, and in the invisible sense, obviously you would understand that some aspects where you're not getting any of the dividends yourself, but your roads are improving, your creches, your schools, your education, your health, etc. And this is why Norway has advanced so fantastically. Across the sea, in poor old Queen Elizabeth's Britain, the wealthy have become wealthier and the poor have become poorer, as the saying goes. Because some of it goes into taxes, go into the revenue, and then they'll say, well, this is being spent on the people. But the situation in Britain, as I've indicated around the world, is one where this Gini coefficient is incredibly huge, as we have in this country. So there are these particular aspects of nationalisation to remind us that it's not the swear word that those privateers and those Thatcherites want you to believe. We come to our country, and I think I've got, how much, 10 minutes for this?
We could start with the question session now because there's 20 minutes remaining.
In how many minutes?
There's 20 minutes.
Oh, remaining.
Remaining for the question session. I think we
Four,
can
okay.
allow you to speak for another 5 minutes.
So in 5 minutes, just to focus in here, our movement, the African National Congress, its alliance, our trade unions, Communist Party, we were always committed to nationalization. And nationalization of that first kind to create the basis to move to socialism. And the Freedom Charter in clause 3 and 4 talks, it doesn't say nationalization. They shied away from the actual use of the N word because they didn't want the Freedom Charter to appear to be too communistic. That was the term. But our people didn't mind. Our people wanted this kind of control. Clause 3, the heights of the economy, the monopolies, the banks, the financial institutions should be put under the control of the people to deal with their needs and to abolish poverty, etc. And clause 4, that the land should be divided amongst the people and given to those who work it. And we believed that, we were committed to that. In 1990, when Madiba in February was released from prison, in his first speech in Cape Town on the Marine Parade, he made the point that we stick to our policy of that Freedom Charter and those clauses. He mentioned it specifically, and he said to change from that is inconceivable. That's Madiba. But within 2 years, he had been to a World Economic Forum in Davos, meeting all these bankers and heads of these Western governments, and they put certain ideas and warnings into his head that when he came back, he said to us, guys, if we're going to think of the Freedom Charter and we're going to think of nationalization, we are doomed because they will cut us off and they will isolate us. And within 2 years, on May Day, I'll never forget the May Day of 1994, he made an astonishing statement, and he said that nowhere in the language or the documents of the ANC can you find the N word and any reference to Marxist ideology. So what had happened to Madiba? And what had happened to all of us? From Thabo Mbeki through to Chris Harney even and others, Joe Slover, we accepted this without a murmur, without debate. We felt that since we were coming to political power, we could shelve the economic aspect and have our political power. And once we receive and we end, because we knew we'd get the majority vote, once we in government, then we could slowly, slowly, as the Swahili say, puli puli, and we say gashly gashly, do it slowly, and we can start changing the economy. But you go back to Marx and Engels and world history, and what I was telling you about the Rumsfelds and the Bushes and the Rothschilds, and the power behind government scenes, that you can have your political power, but you will be eroded by those with the control of the means of production, distribution, exchange, that real wealth of society. That's the problem. And I'm ending now to say that how do we get here? It's really because we made that error. Kwame Nkrumah, great African leader and revolutionary, used to say that first comes the political kingdom, and then we can use the levers to achieve the economic kingdom. And he lived to realize the error. He was thrown out of office by these big capitalists who weren't pleased with his idea of socialism in Ghana. And he was just thrown out and died soon after. Because if you don't have the control of the economy, you've had it. And in the first place, they will attempt to corrupt and bribe and buy the leadership. And that's the struggle taking place now in the ANC. That's the struggle. It's about that. And if you can see some factions who are now saying, no, Zuma and the Guptas, they're the bad ones, you must also ask, well, that faction, who are they representing? Are they like a man I admire. I was with him at a funeral in Lenasia the other day, the great MK hero, Shirish Manabai. And David Makuru, the Premier, dealt with this together with Pravin Gordon about the greed and power we're facing. So we have to look at some elements within the ANC, within my Communist Party, who are now attacking Zuma. But I can tell you, back in 2005, I had my major difference with Comrades Blade and Jeremy and others when I said to them, you guys are wrong now in beginning to support Zuma against Mbeki. You're creating factionalism and you're choosing someone I know better than them. I worked with Zuma in the armed struggle for a long time, and we could see the problems of Zuma. Long ago, conservatism in terms of culture, attitude to women, ethnicity, and so on. They went through there and blamed us because we're comrades together and we want to keep everything united, which is why Madiba also made those mistakes. So you don't start criticizing the person too much. And that, I also mea culpa. So that's how we got here. How do we get out of it? Well, maybe the questions from this side. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, guys, we have about 15 minutes question session, and then we have lunch afterwards. So 15 is 1-5. Actually, less now, it's 13, but go ahead. Can you chair the question session, please?
I want you to.
Oh, okay. Well, Aslam was first, and then Sophia. And then, sorry.
Okay.
I know because he's in front of me. I can't see you behind me.
Yes, you need to come and sit with me. I can see you want to remain with the masses. You don't want to come.
Yes, these are my people. And okay, fine. And then Togozisi.
Can you tell me your names and where you come from?
Okay.
I don't mean whether it's another country, what city, whatever. It's just interesting to know.
So we're going Aslam, Safia, Togozisi, Mawetu, and then Ditwanelo, and then Mpo, right? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 with you, Patu.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief. So I'm concerned about the disciplining power of global capital. So the same thing that Mandela came back with this fear. So people don't like the pointing of Zimbabwe as an example of what is the power of global capital resting in these few hands. As soon as you start using the N-word, as soon as you start mentioning these things, they still have a lot of power. So how do you pragmatically, I suppose, nationalize?
Thanks.
Oh, okay. How many do you want to take at a time?
Yeah, let's take a few questions.
Okay, let's take 3 at a time, no? And then Safia, and then Togozisi.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Sophia from Lenasia.
From?
Lenasia.
Ah.
Okay. Just a question of interest. Since you've left the ANC and the Communist Party, which political party are you currently affiliated with?
Which?
Political party are you currently affiliated with?
Yes, sure.
Nto?
Alright, good morning, sir.
Hi.
My name is Moses Masewa. I'm from Springs, but I'm currently residing in Soweto. Actually, this question that I want to pose to you is a question that I intended to pose to the EFF, but I'm posing it to you because you have spoken about it. So I just want to take it off from the question part to the answer. With the awareness and the reality that what happens when the state or the nation intends to nationalize institutions, like what happened to Saddam or maybe what happened to Gaddafi, etc. What do you think? I mean, with the AFF coming also, they are speaking about it. What do you think is, if that is ready to happen, what is it that we should expect, anticipate as a nation? And how, if ever it's sanctions, if ever it's murder of our leaders, and it's all those brutal response from the capitalist systems, and how do we get out of that?
Okay. We can take two more.
Two more. It was Mowethu next.
So, I mean, my question is, how will nationalization in a country that secludes intersectionality work? I think that's the first question. Because of, I'm thinking, in the instance, our politics still exclude women and queer bodies. Nationalization will still maintain the patriarchy system. And I feel like by virtue of man being in charge, automatically women will still be very much at a point where they're not included in the economic system. And the second one was around the idea of corruption. The past couple of years, we've seen how the ruling party has been very corrupt. So I'm also thinking about then the idea of nationalization and how are we going to ensure that there's balance and checks to ensure that there's no corruption into how then those resources are executed.
You asked two questions, but you want to take another person?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, Dee?
Okay, so my question is more in the sense, since you were very actively involved in the struggle, so my question is more of how history and how leaders have been complicit in the erasure of queer bodies in the struggle, and how that hasn't been documented. Because I mean, we see an influx, or really we see an emphasis on especially privileged men, like men who come from backgrounds where they have class privilege, being put forward as struggle heroes or struggle veterans. So I'm just interested to hear your opinion on the erasure of queer, especially working class queer bodies.
Queer, did you say?
Yeah.
Strange. Good. Is there one other question?
There are two other questions.
Okay.
Paul?
So since you were involved in MK, I'm very, very honored to have someone who actually directly came from there, because we actually read about it the other day. Do you have any manuscript that can kind of help us know how to combat this struggle that we're now facing, which is leaders that are highly entitled, and we want to replace them essentially in the future, but we want to do strategically? And MK, with all the strategies that it took, we can still, I think, apply, because I think they are pretty universal. So do you have any handbook or something that we can use? Because I'm seeing it amongst the youth right now, even with the whole Wits Must Fall or Fees Must Fall situation. We have a lot of people who are now entitled to the struggle, so they're trying to have their face there, and it's not about that. It's about the us, everyone at the bottom. So how do you also counter that?
Yeah.
This whole, like you were saying with the Nelson Mandela, with the ANC, seeing how some of Zuma's decisions create some sort of sectionalism, etc. How do you also counter that from happening? Because we are repeating the steps of our forefathers. Yeah.
Sure. Good question.
And then there is, but can I just, if you guys would allow me, to just add on to tie between what Dee and Mowethu and Mpo just said right now? Can I do that? Just to because what just happened, what's happening right now with Fees Must Fall, just 2 days ago, is that in the attempt to revive the protests at Wits University, the cis heterosexual patriarchal men from both PASMA and the EFF, ANC has been advised to stay out of it, in particular because of what's happening to Zuma and whatever, that they do not want, they cannot afford their young members in the PYA to be involved in the protest. So what's happening is that EFF and PASMA wanted to take advantage of what's currently happening with the president, met as men alone in Pretoria to have a secret meeting about reviving the Fees Must Fall protest. What happened on the day that they planned a shutdown on Monday at Wits University is that they did not invite the women or the queer bodies, and so the women then interrupted their attempt to revive the protest, and there was a violent showdown of the men beating the women and the queer bodies. So now there's a whole campaign. There's a meeting today at 12 o'clock at Wits University about how the movement and the liberation movement will not happen without the voices of women as leaders, as speakers championing the struggle, or it's going to happen without them, or it's not going to happen at all, and they're going to keep disrupting the movement. So that's where those 3 questions come from. Katu.
Interesting. And then the last one now.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Nakapat Chenzo. I'm from Venda. I just want to know, like, looking at the current situation, especially with the ANC, right? With the policy approach that they've taken of the incremental approach of just, as you mentioned, you know, getting the political power that can change bit by bit. Do you think there's any chance that under the ANC we're gonna have total takeover or nationalizations of the parts of the economy? And if not, what are other alternatives? Because when we look at the current situation, in the next coming elections, 100% the ANC is not going to lose the elections. So for how long are we going to just wait as South Africans to actually own the means of production? And what can be our alternatives if the ANC doesn't come out of power?
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you. I think those questions were so interesting. And in the little time we've got, a few minutes, I suppose.
Yes, we don't have that much time, but if you, so we have about 4 minutes until lunchtime. But are you going to? Will we allowing?
We'll sacrifice.
We sacrifice lunch hour.
I think we can try and keep it as short as possible. They're very interesting questions indeed. So just going through them as they appeared, the disciplining power of capitalism. Well, this is a very big challenge. It's not easy. We've seen peoples around the world, we've seen countries, we've seen even so-called communist countries rise and fall, take power like the Soviet Union, Russia, which there's big debate about the extent to which the socialism was really for the people or for the state, and the elitism and the corruption that arose, which does come to some of the questions that you posed, and it's still a big debate. Essentially, we were far too optimistic as guerrilla fighters for MK, as ANC, Communist Party, revolutionary comrades, and we thought once we came in and people internally and externally together, that we would be able to use our political power to control the capitalist class. And I've dealt with how just a few people can take power away. Talking about people behind the scenes, the Rumsfelds, the Rothschilds, the Oppenheimers, and so on. And these are people, this is a capitalist class that's got these enormous resources that can put together coalitions of the willing across the lines, different countries, wage war against dictators because they don't like them. They'll never wage war against dictators that they do like. And amongst them, Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most backward regimes. Women only recently have been allowed to drive cars. People are being executed all the time, and etc. So for them, it's never a question of democracy. It's who toes the line and who works with them. The only answer, and it has happened, you see, Cuba is a wonderful example because it's only 90 miles from America. And because Fidel Castro in his revolution educated the population, black and white, across the board, created equality, created enormous equality of women. I'm not saying that 100% of racism disappeared in Cuba. I'm not saying that 100% of masculine chauvinism disappeared. Cuban men really fancy themselves as great big gigolos, etc. It's a bit of a joke even. But in actual terms, internationally, it's an incredible country on race and gender lines. They've been very bad in relation to homosexuality. So, you can have socialists or communists or revolutionaries coming to power, and they can be good in many, many respects, and they can still be bad and backward in others. Karl Marx dealt with this extensively he said it takes so long for the consciousness of people to catch up with social organization. There's backwardness. I mentioned recently, I was asked by the Star about when I became a non-racist, and it was from my early age, and then with Sharpeville, and I made a joke and I said, because I really liked women. I'm not trying to make jokes here. I think women are lovely. I had a wonderful mother, etc. And I made a joke. And I had quite a number of girlfriends across the colour line, etc. I then got married, and I was married for 48 years, by the way. And I've married again now to a Muslim woman, by the way, and I'm of Jewish origin. But I said to the reporter, you asked me about how I dealt with racism. It was easier for me to deal with that than to deal with my male chauvinism. Because for a long time, without realizing it, I kind of regarded, women are the sex that you've got to protect, and blah, blah, blah. The question of gender is key question. I'm just moving away slightly. I want you to read a book about Karl Marx's daughter called Eleanor Marx. It's a biography. I can't remember the author. It's a woman author. It's the most amazing book about gender, about struggle, about class, about elitism as well. You'll learn so much from it. So I mentioned Cuba as an example. The only way, and China's been an example, the Soviet Union was for a while. I mean, even a crazy mixed up dictatorship like North Korea, in a sense, has stood up. But that's through very extreme measures of control of its population and the fact it's got a nuclear weapon. And we don't want to see that kind of situation. But the world that I've pictured isn't a world that is only going the way of the American empire. It's being eroded, its power. And even Obama had to admit how wrong they've been over Cuba, for example. Bernie Sanders in America is getting tremendous support from the Democratic constituency against a woman. And it would be lovely to see a woman as a president in America, but not Hillary Clinton, who's such a racist, who can say of Gaddafi, who died the vilest death. And I don't know if you know how they finally murdered that man, but she said, we came, we saw, and we killed him, ha, ha, ha. That kind of person. So even in Britain, we've had the Labour revival, etc. It doesn't go their way, and it's all about the unity of exploited and oppressed people. And unless women are emancipated, and I don't want to just push Marxism, because I'm sure the believers here, we have our different faiths and beliefs. I've said that those who stand for justice have a huge universality that we must bear in mind. But in terms of this, you will find from the Marxists right through all the generations, they are leaders in terms of saying, unless the 51% of humanity is not freed, and we're talking about in every single respect, then we won't be free, and we won't create the freedom and equality that is required for all sexes and whatever our preference. And one of the reasons I believe why the Soviet Union in the end failed, because it had tremendous gulf between male and female. Even though in the Russian Revolution and even in their struggles against Nazi Germany, there were women soldiers who were incredible in their bravery. But it was not emancipated. And that's the answer to these backward elements who you've been talking about and explained to me that's been happening on the campus. You have to stand up to them. And we can't allow women to be isolated. We can't allow those of different gender preference, different sexual preference, be they lesbians, gays, homosexuals, transsexual, etc., to be isolated. We have to stand up for each other. And this is where the males must come and stand full square with the females in relation to this current situation and problem that you're facing on the campus. And the people who are so backward really need to be re-educated. But the thing is that re-education doesn't come easily. And that's part of the big problem of humanity, that there are two things that struggle within us. And that's why the religions, the main religions, from the Hindu and the Buddhist to Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and the indigenous religions are so powerful in terms of the way they have a universality. And that's where I believe that socialism has that kind of universality. The difference between Marxists like me is that we don't have we atheist. We do not believe in theistic being, you see. So I think in that sort of general way I was trying to encompass quite a number of things, but to say which party, today I'm speaking for the United Front outside the Constitutional Court with other elements of civic society, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of women there and women speakers as well, otherwise I won't speak. If I find myself on a platform just with men, or in a panel and it's just men, I'd actually protest. And this is how we have to draw the line on little things and big things. In terms of the economic freedom fighters, the Red Berets, by the way, the emergence as people upholding the Freedom Charter and those clauses 3 and 4 was precisely because the ANC Communist Party, and to a degree COSATU, forgot about the N-word and just ignored it because Madiba said that should be the case. And that was elitism. That was the leader, a strong leader, who we all respected, and some felt very uncomfortable to contradict him. We allowed it to happen and just said to each other, well, we'll accept this from the old man, but we're going where we'll win the vote, and through the vote we'll change everything. Heaven forbid, you see what's happened as a result. So the chances of the EFF and nationalization, etc., came up in two different ways. It can only occur, social development can only occur through the unity of people, male and female, young and old, and organized and with correct strategy and so on, and determination and will. This is the way, and this is the way we must deal with what's happening with Zuma now. And what's happened in Parliament. There must be extra parliamentary activity and mobilization. And this is how we overthrew apartheid in the end. MK couldn't have done it alone. If we didn't have mass political mobilization and struggle and international solidarity. And we had, to a degree, it was developing the male-female coming together. There were a lot of women leaders, but not enough. And certainly not enough has been properly imbibed. So the belief that you can just have a third woman in cabinet or parliament, or even 50%, it's not enough. It's got to be real, something real. Just as we can't simply say we're against corruption, we have to have ways of dealing with corruption. And humanity has striven. It's not so easy. And I said a bit earlier, I didn't quite finish, there are two elements, I believe, that struggle within human beings. The one is the very positive aspect. I mentioned this about all the religions, and that is what's good, and it's solidarity. It's coming together, it's standing together, all of us, whatever our backgrounds, and being prepared to sacrifice for other. not just to put oneself first, the selfish aspect. And that's what the other struggle is, where it's just the selfishness that emerges, where you will use for some time your involvement, even as a revolutionary or as a student in struggle or a worker, standing together, and then you become highly ambitious, and the negative aspects, greed and power, that kind of individual ambition, which is what fuels the whole concept of private ownership, that comes to the fore. And that's a battle within each of us. It's very difficult to simply conquer it on your own. You know the saying here regarding Ubuntu, a person is a person because of other people. We correct these problems, we get stronger through our involvement with each other as brothers and sisters, as equals. And that's a key element, in short, to answering that very key question. The question of the woman in the economy, etc., in a sense I've dealt with this by making that point about unless women are totally freed, then there's no way that we're going to resolve those problems. And trade unions must take a lead in this. Okay, I think in a sense, I've answered all of it and touched on all. I can't deal with each of you in the time like as fully as one would want. But will ANC nationalise, and how are we going to see that happening? Well, you know, I'm not saying that what determines the future is whether we say we are going to nationalise or not. I think that what is essential is that we're saying we have to create a more equitable society. We have to end a situation of haves and have-nots, this enormous gulf between the wealthier rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. We have to find a way in which we address this, a proper program, proper implementation, of which ownership of the means of production is one element. This Freedom Charter clauses 3 and 4 are absolutely vital. We can't make headway in this country if we don't deal with the implementation of clauses 3 and 4, which also means we have to tax the very wealthy much more. We made major concessions. You know, one of the big concessions the ANC made was, firstly, we said that in terms of the apartheid debt, which at that stage was 10 billion, a lot of money at that stage, we would pay it. But that was paying for what apartheid had done to our people and the building of its military, etc. When the West said, you know, your country owes 10 billion, we would have said, it's not us. That's the old order. And you know, that money would have gone into the public coffers to help with schools and health, etc., etc. We should have said that the big corporates that had sucked the blood of our people for so long and had benefited so much, that they should pay restitution. Archbishop Tutu made that point in the TRC. We just ignored that. We allowed corporate tax to be lowered from 48% to 26%. That's huge. And we tied into that today. So even when the ANC are saying that we won't nationalise, and they've scrubbed that in terms of the National Democratic, the National Plan, and in terms of the Mangaung Conference, it was all dropped. They said, no, instead we'll apply taxation and royalties. But they're not saying, actually, through the IMF agreement way back, we can't raise the tax to more than 26%. That is nothing for these huge corporates. They laugh at that. And then we allow them to export their capital abroad and to go and sit in the London Stock Exchange and so on and so forth. We allowed the funding to just disappear from this country. So all that has to be reversed. Now that takes guts, like Fidel Castro. It takes guts, and you can't just be gutsy like Chavez on your own, or like, there have been other leaders. You've got to have the masses aware and they've got to understand and they've got to be totally unified, male and female, young and old, and across colour lines. But in the main, we're talking about redressing the poverty of the majority of our people. And will the ANC do it? It will only do it with huge pressure on the ANC. It will only do it with the other movements and organisations, which is why I've joined the United Front emerging, that can make these points clear from the left. And civic society has a very important role to play. Okay, thanks very much.
Just on behalf of the ASRI Fellows, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that, we are thankful for your presence here and for contributing, and I hope that you have spoken to some of the subversives, which is a term that you used in the room, because I know they do exist, and that everyone has a lot to think about, and that you've spoken so honestly and frankly, and I think we appreciate that a lot. Let's give him another round of applause.